Music New South Wales is on the unceded land of the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also extend those respects to any First Nations people that are joining us for this info session. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura from Music New South Wales. Welcome to Sound Advice. Are you being ripped off? That's the question that we're asking today. Did you know that the superannuation laws changed just last year? Regarding superannuation payment for contractors. So if you're a sole trader in the music industry, this is probably going to impact you. And it's quite complex. It's not that straightforward. And many people might be inadvertently doing the wrong thing, or maybe not getting, paid for what they're owed. And honestly, it's a little bit confusing, especially if you're a sole trader. So this info session is really to help you understand if you're owed super or if you should be paying it. So we've asked accounting and tax experts Generate to help you understand who should be getting paid and who should be doing the paying. So we have Generate's accountant extraordinaire, Emma Brophy, here to take you just through the finer details and answer any questions that you may have. But before I introduce you to Emma, I'd just like to note that Music New South Wales is supported by Create New South Wales and APRA AMCOS. So I'm just going to pull Emma up onto the screen. Hi, Emma. Welcome.
Hiya, how you going?
Really good. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, you used to co-run a record store in Wollongong, and that's when you realized that your accounting knowledge could help other people like yourself. And I hear that you have a particular passion for demystifying tax and accounting for people in creative spaces. So welcome, and tell us a little bit about what you do in your role at Generate.
Yeah. So hi, everybody. My name is Emma. At Generate, I am a client manager and I deal with and help a lot of musicians in my role. So, these people, musicians and musician assistant sort of people, so like lighting techs and managers and all of these sorts of people. So I've got a really broad range of the music industry and what happens within the music industry as well. I've been in this role at Generate for coming up 4 years now. And yeah, music is something I've always been really passionate about. I play in some bands, I've played in bands. You can see, music is a big part of my life. So it's fabulous to be able to help other musicians come to terms with sort of what the ATO requires us to do, because then the ATO is not going to go away. So, it's good to be able to, do things as they're supposed to be done and get paid some super, which we'll be talking about today. It's basically getting paid.
Yeah, great. And thanks so much for being here with all this insight to kind of talk us through that, sort of navigate us through this this slight minefield. Because like I was saying before, it is tricky. So it's really great to have you here. So I'm just gonna share my screen and pull this up. Here we go. Great. And so I guess you can take it away.
Sure. Alrighty. So thanks for being here with us, everybody. So today we're going to talk about superannuation for musicians. What does that all mean? What's happening with it and whatnot? So there's a couple of things that we'll go through. As you can see, the slides going back and forth. There's a couple of things to go through, but it's all set out in a way that it'll flow through really nice and simply, and you'll be like, all right, fabulous, this is what it is. So last year or a couple of years ago, the government I think it was the Liberal government in the budget, had made some changes to superannuation laws. What I'll sort of note overarchingly is that superannuation for contractors has been a thing for a long time. It's just not something that I find that a lot of sole traders know about. Basically, it's not something, because you're paying somebody as a contractor through an invoice, it seems like, superannuation, I don't need to pay it. I only need to pay super to employees, like proper employees who you've, pay weekly, monthly, fortnightly wages to. But that's not the case, and that's not been the case for quite a long time. So the new laws that have come through are two main things. Firstly, that the superannuation rate is increasing in small increments up until the 2026 financial year. So we've started off, for ages and ages, it was 9.5%. And then for the previous financial year, it was 10%. Current financial year is 10.5%. From 1st of July 2023, so in a couple of months' time, it's going to go up to 11%. And that'll keep going up until it reaches 12%. So we've still got a couple of years to keep going with this. And so when we are doing invoices for people, when we're invoicing others for our services, or when we're paying people for the services that they've provided us, we're always just going to make sure that we're paying the correct super rate. I've seen a couple of clients who were like, oh yeah, I'll just pay the super at 9.5, that's fine. But that's not been the rate for a couple of years now. The second thing that I think will actually get which will capture a lot of sole traders, is the $450 monthly maximum amount has been scrapped. So what that means is that previously, before the 1st of July 2022, if you paid a contractor or paid an employee even for doing a job and whatnot, $400 a month, let's say, you didn't actually have to pay them any superannuation. That's been scrapped now as at the 1st of July 2022. So if you pay somebody $100 for their services to you, you've got to pay super at 10.5%. And so those are the two really big headlining things that we are going to talk about today. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so these slides are basically in the style of a flowchart. We're going to go through your situations from the beginning all the way through. Some people, if you've got an invoice that you've received in mind, and you can sort of use that to be like, okay, what are we going to, how can I apply this? We just follow through with the steps, and then we'll get to the outcome at the end. So first of all, the first step that we always got to go through is, while running your business or organization, are you paying somebody to do something for you? Now, what's a business? This might seem like an obvious sort of question to ask and maybe an obvious answer, but in some instances, you might be operating as a hobby and not necessarily as running a business. So the ATO views that a business involves a set of continuous and repeated activities for the purpose of making a profit. So you want to be invoicing semi-regularly, and you want to be doing it for profit, whether that be, even if it's like, oh, if I do this service for you, will you do this for me? If you're just charging money and whatnot, as long as you're doing it with a view to make a profit, you'll be running a business. I'm going to say 99 out of 100 of you are going to have an ABN, which is an Australian business number. By having an ABN, you can be like, yes, I'm running a business. Fabulous. That's all good. And what I'll note is that if you're an employee and you're paying somebody, you're not running a business. You're an employee. Your employer is running the business. They'll be doing the paying and whatnot. And if you're performing maybe every now and again as a hobby, and you have a day job that you're working most of the time, and you perform on the side just because it's something that you really enjoy and that gives you satisfaction, but you're not looking at it as something you want to make full time or something that you're really looking to make money from, then that's a hobby and you don't need to pay superannuation. So next up then, we have are you over 18 years old? I'm going to take a wild guess and say that most of you are. Or if you're paying somebody that's under 18, are they working more than 30 hours a week for you? So essentially, is this person who's under 18 working essentially full time? If no, then you don't need to pay any superannuation. That's all fabulous. If they are over 18 or they are working more than 30 hours a week and are under 18, then we go to the next slide and see whether or not we need more super. So Next up then is if they are a resident of Australia for tax purposes.
I might just jump in quickly and ask a question, Emma, just on the under 18 and working more than 30 hours a week. In the music industry, like hours can really fluctuate, even if you're under 18 years old. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you quantify that when you're thinking about this slide?
So if you're under 18 and you do 25 hours one week, for example, and 30 hours for the next week, that week that you do 25 hours a week, no super is payable. And then the next week it resets again. And if you're working 30 hours a week just for that week, then super will be payable on that 30 hours. So yeah, you've got to look at it on a week by week basis. And again, this is for only people who are under 18. Yeah. If you're over 18, it doesn't matter. You've got to get paid, you've got to apply the super laws basically. But if you're under 18, if you do 25 hours one week, you don't need to get paid super. If you do 30 hours the next week, you need super on that 30 hours. You don't have to combine the previous 25 hours with the current 30. It's just in that week. You just look at that week.
It's like week by week.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Cool. Thanks.
Cute. Alrighty. So is this person that you're paying a non-resident for tax purposes, or are they working overseas? So this one's a little bit more difficult. Obviously, it's a bit of a funny question to ask somebody, oh, are you an Australian resident for tax purposes? And sometimes people won't know either. What I would generally say is that, okay, if you're hiring somebody to edit a video or, do something digitally for you and they're based overseas and they're always overseas, then super's not going to be payable. If you've hired somebody who is visiting Australia for, less than 6 months, for example, and you've hired them to do a specific job for you for a month or something like that, or, just do a task while they're here in Australia, it's likely that you won't need to pay super, but if they are here for generally it's over half the year, which would mean that they would be a resident of Australia for tax purposes, which means that super would be payable. So if somebody's here just for a really short amount of time and you pay them to do a job for you, super probably won't be payable. If they're overseas, super probably won't be payable. If you have somebody who's lived in Australia for a long time, you can assume that yes, they'll be an Australian tax resident. If you've hired somebody who's in Australia for a year, for example, you can probably assume that they would be a tax resident of Australia. It's always great to ask though, and just say, hey, look, I know that I probably, I might have to pay you super. Can you please advise, are you a resident for tax purposes of Australia? And they can advise yes or no, and you can go from there. Alrighty. So next up then is, are you paying them as a normal employee? So, this is somebody who's got a contract, a full-time, part-time, casual contract. And it's those jobs that, a lot of us have had where you're working at Macca's or you're working in an office or something like that. You're just an actual, just genuine employee in every normal sense of the word. Then, yeah, super's got to be paid. And that's something that I think that we would all expect to happen. So, yeah, there's that. But a lot of the stuff that we'll be talking about, it will be in the next couple of slides for contractors. But, yeah, in the first instance, if you're a normal employee of an organization, then yes, you should be getting paid super. Alrighty. Next up then is, are you paying them as a contractor? So this is somebody or an entity that you are paying via an invoice, essentially. So you're a musician, for example, you're in a band and your lighting tech has given you an invoice for the services for a couple of shows that they've done work for you for. So that's a contractor in the ordinary sense of the word. What we all find here is that the Superannuation Act, which is extremely long and extremely convoluted and not exceptionally clear at all, defines a contractor differently from what we would as just like regular people just having a station. So if via a contractor, as a contractor, that's all well and good. So yeah, basically, if you're paying somebody via an invoice, that they'll be a contractor. If we're getting through to this flowchart and you're like, wait, no, I'm not, then something's been lost in translation. Go back to the start the process again. But a lot of you, yes, that'll be the case. So we'll go off to the next slide.
I was just wondering.
This is where it gets interesting.
I was just wondering if I could maybe break down a little bit of like when within the music, like you did an example before, but maybe we could talk through a couple of other examples, like how that might define a contractor within the music industry. So an artist manager, could they be a contractor for an artist?
Yeah. So artist managers, booking agents, there's the list is huge. Basically, if you're receiving an invoice, it's going to for somebody's time, which we'll get more into. Then it's not like you've gone to JB Hi-Fi or something and had to purchase something. That's not that obviously isn't a contractor. But if you're paying somebody for their services rather than for goods, then I'm going to say 99 out of 100 times contractor.
Cool. So it really applies to the music industry. So that's like venues, artist managers, like it's across, lighting techs, all that kind of stuff. It's across the whole board.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extremely broad.
Great.
Alrighty. So this is sort of where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. And in some places, you'll have a couple of people whose journeys will stop here, and that'll be great. So the next thing to do is we check the invoices ABN via the Australian Business Registry to double check what sort of structure they are. So if you've received an invoice from somebody and you've checked up their ABN and they operate either as a partnership, so that'll be something like ABC and XYZ, then super is not, then you don't need to pay super. If you're paying somebody and it's, Music New South Wales, Pty Ltd, that's a company and you don't need to pay any super. If you're looking it up and it says Music New South Wales Family Trust, then super is not payable. If you're paying somebody that operates via an entity structure, so a partnership, a company, a trust are the three main ones that we see. We rarely see any other sort of structure than that. Then you as a person don't need to pay super. You can just pay the invoice and that's fine. Because in theory, what's happening on the other side of that is that person who runs the company will organize a super on their behalf, because in theory, they have employees that they need to pay super for. However, if you go up and you check and see, oh, they're a sole trader, then potentially we do need to pay super. So if you are a company, for example, you run your services through a company and you receive a sole trader invoice, maybe you might have to pay super. If you're a company and you receive an invoice from another company, you don't need to pay super. But it doesn't matter what sort of structure you are as the person who's received the invoice. Super's only payable to a sole trader, essentially. So if we have a partnership company or trust, don't need to pay any super. If we are a sole trader, then we do need to pay super. Well, potentially we need to pay super. So on the next slide then, we'll go through some situations. So this is a thing that is going to capture a lot of us in the music industry. I'm going to say basically everybody in the music industry. So if the invoice you've received is being paid to an artist or an entertainer to perform or participate in some kind of event or production, so that could be, a band playing at a show, or you could be performing, you're on the stage, you're an actor and you're being paid to perform a show or something like that. Those sorts of instances. And the other interesting thing is that, are you being paid to support those services for the production? So the examples that come to mind are people, like the lighting tech we were talking about before, and potentially managers, booking agents, roadies, all of these people that help put on a performance, via either, being physically there or sort of being in the background that allows the band member, for example, to go and do this performance, then they get captured by this as well. If you're being paid in relation to making some sort of recording or broadcast, so that's something like, a music video, or if you're being paid to film something for, promotional material that's going to go out for a band and whatnot, that all gets encapsulated here. And so the ATO say if you are basically in the music industry or providing services to those in the music industry, then you probably need super paid to you. This is something that basically, it was something when I first started that was news to me, because you can go through all of ththese questions and whatnot and be like, oh no, it's all fine, like we don't need to do anything. But basically the ATO have taken the view, and I guess by extension the government have taken the view that musicians are historically underpaid. Superannuation, it's a lot of, I'm not sure how so much it is these days, but it'd be a lot of cash in hand and be like, oh, here you go, like you've come to the gig, here's some cash, like thanks very much. And we get to the end of the day and we have these, you get to the end of let's say a sole trader's life, and they're not life, excuse me, but like they're coming to retiring and they don't have any super because they've operated in a space that historically hasn't had much super paid out to them. The government are trying to avoid people having to go on Centrelink or go on the government pension and whatnot. So by capturing these people, musicians and people who are helping musicians in the first instance, saying, okay, you need super paid to you, then that's their way of sort of avoiding that. So I would make a bet that, a lot of the people here in the seminar today will be captured under this. So if you're in a band and you're performing, if you're a booking agent, if you are an artist manager, if you are, at a venue even, it's a lot of these things you'll just sort of get captured by this in the first instance. Whereas if you were in another industry, like if you were providing, like just general consulting services, like general accounting, so consulting services, for example, super, we'd have to go through the steps, but you might not need to be paid super. But because we're operating in the music industry and we're operating as entertainers and artists performing and supporting those that are performing, you need super paid to you, essentially.
Yeah, and maybe I thought it might be good just to talk through just a couple of scenarios again here for this. So say, for example, if like a venue booked an artist, but then an artist booked an engineer for front of house for that venue performance, how does that work in this scenario?
So you would need to look at the agreements and the contractors between everyone. Oh, pardon me. Sorry, 1 second. Thank you. All right. So you've got to look at the agreements with everybody, essentially. So if the artist was hired the engineer, then the artist needs to pay that engineer super, assuming that engineer is a sole trader. If the venue has hired the band to perform, and the band, is let's say, if the performer is a sole trader, then the venue needs to pay the artist. If the venue have hired a band and they operate through a partnership or through a company or through a trust, then the venue doesn't need to pay any super, because the person the entity that they're paying is operating through one of those categories that don't need super paid to them. So you've always got to look at the contracts basically and look at the agreements, whether they would have, if, no matter how rudimentary they are, if they are, if it's just through a text or something, it's who, or if it's just a verbal agreement, or if it's like a full-on proper contract, depending on the scale of the arrangement and whatnot. We've always got to have a look and say, okay, so who hired who? So if the artist had hired the sound engineer, then the artist needs to pay the sound engineer super, essentially.
Yeah. Great. That's really clear. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. So that's, that previous slide was going to capture most of us, but for argument's sake, let's keep going down the flowchart and saying, okay, so I'm not paying somebody to help me perform or to perform or even something like that. It's something that sits outside of that. So are they being paid principally for their labor? So it is at least 50% of their invoice value for their time and not materials. So what does this mean? So this means that, somebody has provided a service to you. It's not something like, somebody has invoiced me to hire backline or something like that, or to hire cameras. They're not being paid principally for their labor. They're being paid for their materials. And in that instance, super wouldn't be payable, essentially. So, for example, if you were paying, if we go back on the previous sort of examples, if you hired a tech to go out with you on the road, you're paying them for their time. You're paying for them to come out with you on the road. And so therefore, you would need to pay them superannuation, because for that short amount of time, they're acting as an employee for you, essentially. I find that when we sort of review these sort of things, overarching is, I think, okay, no matter how long they're actually working for me for, are they acting like what I would assume an employee would act like? So, you'll have a tech with you for, a couple of days or, a couple of weeks or months even, helping you out with shows and whatnot. They're with you, they're doing stuff for you, basically only. That's the way that an employee would act. And so it's likely then that superannuation will need to be paid. If if you're paying somebody to provide materials for you, or, they're just, basically just materials, then you're not paying somebody for their time, and superannuation isn't payable. So for example, Generate wouldn't pay me to provide, they wouldn't pay me super if I provided them a bunch of laptops or something like that for work. They pay me to come into work and, prepare tax returns and, do services like these. So they're paying me for my time, therefore super's payable, essentially. It's all very complicated and whatnot, but if you think about it, like, is this person essentially acting as what I would think an employee is acting like, despite the fact that they've given you an invoice and that they're not an actual bona fide employee, then super's probably payable.
How does it work when you're in a scenario if, like, say, for example, you're an artist and you're playing at a venue, but part of your payment for your labor and your performance is via a door deal, how does that impact stuff like this?
You're still being paid to perform. If you didn't perform, you wouldn't receive any funds from the door deal, essentially. Yeah. So you would still get paid. You should, if it's a sole trader, you should still get paid super in that instance.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about other examples of labor and how it might relate to kind of other people in the industry. So, like, say if you were an independent manager, for example, and you kind of were, is it labor for the service that it would be labor for the service that you're providing your artist or artists? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because the artist manager in theory is, looking out for deals. They're organizing things for the artist and whatnot. They are taking time in order to provide services, hopefully everything going well. They are providing a service to their artist essentially by way of, organizing deals for them, organizing tours, doing all of these sorts of services, because they are performing services. If the artist manager is operating as a sole trader, super could be payable. What I would note though is that venues and booking agents and artist managers, from what I've come across. A lot of the time they do operate as either companies or partnerships or trusts. So you don't need to pay the super. I haven't come across any artist managers who operate as a sole trader yet, never say never. But it's not as it's unlikely to occur. But again, when you're paying these invoices and whatnot, and you're going through, look at the ABR, the Australian Business Registry, and see what sort of what structure your manager is using to determine, okay, do I need to pay super or not?
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right. So, okay, fabulous. So, are you paying a contractor based on time or to achieve a defined result? So if you're paying somebody like on a retainer, for example, then you need to pay superannuation. If you're paying somebody to be with you for a month while you go on the road or do something like that, or you're paying somebody to be a session musician for while you're recording or something like that, it's likely that you will be that you're invoicing the contractor is invoicing you for their time. So often you'll see things like a day rate, for example. It'll be a day rate, it'll be an hourly rate. Those sort of things are the main indicators that you're paying somebody for their time. Paying somebody for a specific result would be like, oh, I'm going to pay a contractor $1,000 to edit a video for me. Doesn't matter how long it takes them. It doesn't matter if they make a mistake or something like that. They're not going to invoice you for additional time that they've taken to do this. You've given them a task of doing the editing, and that's $1,000, and they can take as long as they need to. Well, in theory, they can take as long as they need to in order to do it. The payment's still going to be the same. Whereas if you're recording and you've hired a session musician, and they hire you on a day rate, then you'll be hiring them for their time, and super will need to be payable. So in these, like an argument that you can sort of make here, and this is why superannuation is a little bit complicated, is that, if we take the session musician example and run with that for a little bit, if, you've hired a bass player, for example, and, you need to put them to lay down the tracks for an album, and that's what you've hired them to do. Again, if they've invoicing, you're not going to really see somebody saying, oh, like my invoice is for laying, for recording 3 bass tracks. It didn't matter how long it was going to take. It was only going to be, a couple $100. Let's say it was $500, for example. You'll 99 out of 100 times will say like, oh, the goal was to lay down 3 tracks, but I'm paying you for the time in order it takes me to do that. So it's going to be $500 a day, or $500 over 3 days. If you bring any sort of time elements into it, superannuation needs to be paid. Not to go on too much of a further rant about it to confuse everybody, but, again, let's think about it like, oh, are they acting like an employee? If you're an employee, you get paid for your time. You get paid an hourly rate, or you get paid your hourly rate for the work that you're doing there. And if you have to do, a lot of work overtime, then you can, hopefully, you can get paid overtime for that. Whereas if you were just getting paid to edit the video and that's it doesn't matter how long it takes, then you potentially won't need to pay super. Again, we go back though to that slide that we had before. I think it was slide 6, where if you're helping somebody in the music industry, if you're creating a video even, then you've got to pay super.
This is a really great kind of bunch of questions, tools that you've prepared specifically for us. So what we're going to do is we'll actually design it up into a resource, and it will sit alongside this video on our website. And you also have a bunch of kind of sort of like over explanations and then some tips as well that we'll just go through now, and then we can jump into some questions. I've seen a few questions come through in the Q&A, so we can get into them then.
Yep.
Cool.
Alrighty, so yeah, basically if you go through all of these steps that you'll receive in the handout and whatnot, you'll have an employee that's defined by the Superannuation Guarantee Act. So as we discussed, even though they've invoiced you and to you and I, they would be a contractor. In the eyes of the ATO via the Super Guarantee Act, they're an employee and therefore need super. So the superannuation rate for the 2023 financial year, which is from the 1st of July 2022 to the 30th of June 2023, is 10.5%. And that amount needs to be paid no later than 28 days after the end of the current quarter. So that means that if you've hired somebody to do something between the 1st of July 2022 and the 30th of September 2022, that superannuation needs to be paid by the 28th of October. And that goes for all of the quarters as well. And the reason why it's so important to pay the super 28 days later is that if it's paid outside of that 28 days, the superannuation expense that you would have had in your accounts no longer becomes deductible to you. And in those situations, what would happen is if you pay, let's say, 2 months after you were supposed to, we have to lodge forms with the ATO that say, oh, I was supposed to pay this super, and you pay it essentially to the ATO, and the ATO act as a clearinghouse to send that super onto the relevant person. However, doing that, it incurs a $20 admin fee for every employee that happens to. So if you forget employee by the super definition sense, so if you've accidentally forgot to pay 10 contractors, for example, that's 10 times 20. Those fees can rack up really, really quickly. And you also will have to pay interest on the amount of super that you didn't pay. And that interest represents the earnings that the fund in theory would have made if it was sitting in the account, but those interest charges are also non-deductible to you. So, first of all, it has to be done. It's the law. We need to pay 28 days after the end of the current quarter, but there can be decent tax effects if that doesn't happen as well, by way of deductions not being allowed and additional fees that you've got to pay to the ATO in order to sort of square it off and make it right. So some tips for paying super then. What I find with a lot of my clients and whatnot that I see is that if you need to tell people in the first instance that, hey, I'm providing a service for you on a time basis and I'm in the music industry, so you're going to need to pay me super. Now and in that negotiation process in the first instance should be like, okay, if my day rate is $1,000, is that $1,000 inclusive or exclusive of super? Because that can make quite a difference to what you actually get paid in your bank account. So it's always great to make sure that you're upfront with the person that you're contracting with to make sure that they know what the expectations are in the first instance. I've had some clients tell me that, if they don't pay their contractors sometimes until they receive their super details, because if, as the person who's paying the invoice, it's your responsibility to make sure that the super's paid. And the ATO can be quite harsh on super that's not being paid. And they say, even though, you might try and you're contacting this person to get their super details so that you can do the correct thing and pay them. The ATO still say, well, it is what it is. You should have been upfront with them, not upfront with them, but you should have had their details in the first instance, and so you're the person who gets in trouble. It's not the person who doesn't give you their super details. as we discussed before, making sure that payments are made before the 28-day end of the quarter. You can pay super basically whenever you want within the quarter. So if you have an invoice that you've received on the 31st of July, you can pay their super on the 1st of August or on the 31st of July. That's totally fine. Everything will be deductible. It's once you get after that 28 days that's when it becomes non-deductible, and that's when it becomes a problem. So yeah, always ensuring as well that, as the person who receives the invoice, it's your obligation to pay the super. You can't just negotiate it away. You can't pay somebody an additional 10.5%, say, oh, okay, this is for your super, you transfer it to your super fund. The ATO don't like that. They say, no, you need to pay the super, even though you've given them the money to be like, no, this is for your super. You have to do it. You can't just leave it to the sole trader to organize themselves. And another handy tool, which will be in the links and whatnot, is ensuring, when you're going through this and you've got an invoice that you've received from a contractor, there's a really, really handy decision tool on the ATO's website that will go through basically all of these that we've been through just here, so that you can decide, okay, do I actually need to pay somebody super? You can print this off as well and send it to, if you don't have their super details, you can go through and be like, look, I've done everything. It looks like you're an employee for super purposes. I've got to actually pay you some super. Please see attached this. What are your super details? That's what I do when I'm doing clients' work, and I have a contractor invoice. I go, okay, what is this actually for? I use the ATO super decision tool. It's really, really handy. It's really, really easy to use. And it's always good to keep a record of that on file, just in case, the ATO ever come and check your books. It does happen, where people get audited and reviewed by the ATO. If you have those documents to say, look, I did actually go through the process, the tool said I didn't need to pay super, so I didn't pay super, then you have that backing detail there and you're all good, essentially. Some more tips on the next page. So if you're, 9 times out of 10, you'll have an ABN to be getting paid super. It's worthwhile noting that you don't actually need to have an ABN. There are some instances where if you're doing something that's if you're paying somebody and that person says, oh, it's just a hobby, you still might need to pay them some super. It's very convoluted and is never actually been tested in court, which is, something that us accountants use to be like, okay, how, what do the ATO actually mean by these big sweeping statements that they make in their laws and whatnot? But yeah, so basically, if you go through everything and it says, yep, we need to pay super, then that is what it is.
Just if someone doesn't have an ABN, what do they do then if they are due super?
If they don't have an ABN and they're due super, they should just give the person the superannuation details. So that'll be things like your member, super fund member number, the USI, the name of the super fund, and you just give that to that person, and they in theory should pay you the super, assuming that we've gone through all of the other things and that says yes, super is payable. But again, it's a grey area in the law, because one would assume that if you were doing a hobby, then you weren't running a business, that super wouldn't be payable. It sort of makes sense on a human to human sort of level. However, the wording of the Act doesn't exclude people who are like doing hobbies, who are undertaking services as a hobby. It doesn't exclude it specifically. Then again, though, it hasn't been tested in the court at all. So, when and if that happens, it'll be very interesting to see whether or not, if you paid somebody $100 just to do a small thing for you, and it turns out, oh, yep, the ATO thinks that they're an employee, whether or not like the actual super that would be paid. But to be conservative, which is what us accountants always like to do, we always sort of take the worst case sort of scenario. You would pay that person super. Another really important thing to do, and what I find will likely get your super actually paid for you a lot easier, is if you include your super details in the invoice that you send to people. That will sort of jog their memory as well, that, oh, I actually have to pay this person super, and you know, it'll go a long way to actually getting your super paid for you. So if in your invoice template that you have on your computer or wherever, if you include your superannuation details in there, I believe you'll be a lot more likely to have super paid for you. And the last sort of thing is consolidating your super funds. So I know that I used to have, like, you know, when I was finishing high school and had all these, you know, random like part-time jobs, I had a whole bunch of super funds for some reason, because, you know, they would just set up a super fund for me. And then the ATO have made it really, really easy now to consolidate all of your super into the one place, because you're going to get the best returns if all of your, like, the best returns in your super funds if all of the funds are in the one place. You can do that by logging onto your MyGov account. And I think there's a tab that says super, and then you go into the super details, and there's just like a big green button from memory, if you've got multiple funds, that says consolidate your super, and that's it. It's really, really simple to do. This ATO does all the forms necessary for you and whatnot, and you can choose, okay, I want to consolidate, you know, funds A into B, do it like that. It's very, very simple. But yeah.
Amazing, Emma. Thank you so much for taking us through everything. We have lots of links that we're gonna that you mentioned that we're gonna make sure that everyone gets access to, and I can see that in our Q&A we have quite a lot of questions. So I might just stop sharing the screen now, and then I'm just gonna jump in, I think, into the questions, and we can start with them. So I might just start at the top. I haven't looked through any of these, but we've got an anonymous question for, I was offered a year-long contract where I was engaged as an independent contractor, given that the work would have been consistent and I would have had to invoice monthly for the same amount. It's my understanding that I would have to be owed superannuation on top of my salary offer.
From the information provided, that sounds correct. I'm assuming, anonymous attendee, that you're acting as that you're a sole trader and that you're not operating through a company or a trust or a partnership. But yeah, if you were offered a contract and the contract was for a year and you're invoicing at the end of every month for your time that you'd spent during that month, it looks, you know, likely, obviously without lots of details and whatnot, I wouldn't be able to say for sure, but from the detail that you've provided here, looks like you probably would need super. But of course, in all of these instances, check with your accountant. Yeah, it's an important overarching thing to say, because, you know, your accountant will know your specific circumstances and whatnot. This is all sort of just general advice.
Yeah. We also have another question. If you're an independent artist and you're hiring a musician for a gig, like a contractor, or someone to edit your video, do you have to pay them super?
Probably. Again, if they're operating as a sole trader, then yes, likely you will have to pay them super. And it's one of these things that in the music industry, because super hasn't been paid for, like, you know, oftentimes, you know, we just pay people like either a small amount of money or pay them some cash, or, you know, there hasn't really been a culture of superannuation being paid to people. So you know, there will be a lot of these sort of instances where you pay somebody, you know, you pay a session musician to perform a show with you because they're operating to support a performing artist, or, you know, they are a performing artist. That overarching rule means that they likely need super paid to them.
Great, thanks for that. We also have, I think you kind of touched on it before, but it's just maybe good to kind of refresh. Katie asked if we have established, so we need super paid, so they know they need super paid. Does it get added to the invoice amount at the end? How can you make sure that people know if it should be on top of or inclusive?
Always in the first instance, talk to the person that you're contracting with to make sure that you're both on the same page, that your fee is inclusive or exclusive of super. So, but, let's say now that, you did the contract like 2 months ago, you're now actually invoicing for your time. How do we go about doing this? Have a chat with that person that you're contracting with and say, okay, my $1,000 day rate, for example, is exclusive of super, and include that in your invoice saying, here's my day rate, here's 10.5% super. Make sure you include your superannuation details in the invoice as well, so that it makes it as easy as possible for the person paying you to get your super paid as well. But yeah, you'll have to, if you haven't negotiated that at the beginning of the contract, talk to them about it, talk to that person about it and say, okay, look, like I have to, with the ATO decision tool, you can show them the printout saying, look, I need super paid to me. And then begin that negotiation of, is your fee inclusive or exclusive of super? And there's no right or wrong answer. As long as superannuation is being paid, then that's totally fine. If you decide that your $1,000 day rate is inclusive of super, that just means that you'll get paid, $890 something in your actual bank account, and then that other 10.5% will go to your super fund. If you're deciding that your day rate is exclusive of super, then you'll get your $1,000, and then your contractor person will send the 10.5% to your super fund.
Great.
Hope that answers your question.
I think this is also another good one just to kind of touch on again. We did sort of mention it before, but I feel like there's some pretty clear advice there that you could probably provide John with, which is what do you do if you're in a band and all operating as sole traders with ABNs? So like one band member invoice the payments and then, pay everybody else? How would that kind of work if that was the setup?
This is probably a question that you would need to ask your accountant, but generally speaking, it's all about sort of like the administration of it and like how are you actually going to get that paid. So if if there's 4 of you in the band and you're all operating as sole traders, my concern is that the venue, let's say who has hired you and who is paying you, would need to pay, in theory, from what we've been talking about before, they would need to pay all of you super. If you have, one band member invoice the venue for everybody and then they disperse it to everybody else, my concern is that super would get paid to the one band member who did the invoicing, and that the super for the remaining band members may not get paid. In that instance, it's a little bit of a difficult one in that, the law says what the law says, and that's, it's fairly clear that, in that instance, you should all get super. But on an actual administrative level, how that would happen, it's a little bit more fiddly and unclear. So I would suggest potentially that maybe the 4 of you invoice the venue as individuals. That way it makes it nice and simple. You're cutting out the middleman. There's a clear trail of where everything's going and whatnot. But yeah, talk to your accountant if you've got one about what you would, the practicalities of doing that, and whether or not, if you are operating as a band, maybe you form a partnership, for example, and, in that instance, and then you're all operating as the one, as the one entity. But again, speak with your accountant. They'll be able to provide more bespoke advice. But yeah, I think in the broad overview would be that everybody would invoice the venue for their own time, the 4 individual invoices, so that the venue can pay everybody correctly for super.
Great. And just to double confirm for Michael that super payments to contractors are tax deductible.
If they're made on time, yes.
Cool.
They have to be made no later than 28 days after the end of the quarter. If they're not paid after that time, then they're not tax deductible.
So I'm just having a quick look through the questions again now. So me as a facilitator, I have to charge accordingly to the venues, increase my rate so that I'm able to ensure my fellow musicians are paid. Like that's kind of possibly going, just sort of recapping on what you were talking about before, actually. But I guess, again, if you're talking about rates, and that's a question for people's kind of, they would have to decide that kind of before any of the sort of, yeah.
Yeah, in theory, yeah. So when you're negotiating with the venue for performing and whatnot, that would be something that you would talk about in the first instance. Well,
Correct.
you would hope that you would talk about in the first instance, so that everybody is on the same page, so that if you are due super, that you actually are getting paid super, and there's minimal, stuff around to actually get that paid to you.
Is performance considered a task or time?
It's difficult to sort of determine. If you're talking about, like, what we were talking about before, being like, oh, you're being paid to put on a performance, that's in the sort of ordinary sense of like, oh, you're getting up on stage and you're performing to a group of people, like you're doing a gig or something like that. In that instance, we don't even get to the time versus materials or time versus labor sort of discussion. That's because we stop at that sort of slide 6 and says, oh, okay, you're performing as a musician, therefore you're due super. We don't even get down that road, essentially.
Okay, cool. Someone was just asking, Joe, I think, G Music was just asking a question about the door deal example that we discussed. And again, it was, it's about kind of putting, like, is the super inclusive or not? And so I suppose that's the sort of thing, again, you'd have to clarify when you were arranging that door deal with the venue, that they would have to, either it would be inclusive or added on top of the door deal.
Yeah, that's right. Because at the end of the day, that door deal, so you're saying, if you sell, you get a cut of the door, for example, that's your compensation for the services that you're performing. You're not there selling the tickets. You're there to perform, and their way of compensating you for that is by a percentage of the door sale. So when you, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but when you do go into those negotiations in the first instance, it's important to say, oh, okay, is that percentage of the door deal then going to be inclusive or exclusive of super? Because I believe that super's owed to me.
Right. Thank you. Karen was asking, I don't think there is there like a definitive kind of list of who supports an artist? Is there something like that exists?
Unfortunately not. Yeah. It's very frustrating that there isn't, but yeah, no, there's nothing that's a list of that. I would say that, as we were talking about before, if you're somebody who's there in the moment to help a performance, then super's likely payable to you. But, I know in Karen's example, somebody who does design work for a show poster on a fixed rate, potentially not, because they're far removed from the event that's happening. They're putting the poster together. It's not somebody who's there, being the sound tech or doing the lights or, in that sort of intimate contact with the performer. Oftentimes they'll be sort of like, they're not there at the time that the performance is happening. Actually, that's probably a good thing. Are they there at the time that the performance is happening? Or if they're not, do they work with the band in an extremely close manner, like a manager or a booking agent, for example, to get that performance sort of done? So somebody who creates a poster for a live event likely won't need, just if we go through all of the other factors, maybe, but, on that instance of, are they supporting a performance? Probably not, I would think. But again, there's no case legislation to say anything definitive about this, unfortunately. It's all we sort of interpret. But good, a good rule of thumb is, be conservative. If in doubt, go through the ATO decision tool. When you go through the ATO decision tool, you'll find that if you're paying somebody to do a fixed fee for doing that thing, you likely won't get down to the part that says, are you paying somebody as a musician? And they'll be like, oh, okay, you're paying a contractor. No super's payable.
We've got a great question.
So use the tool.
We've got a great question from Trace. Can contractors backdate super payments?
I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to get back to you on that, Trace. I think probably they can, because again, it'll be the person who has contracted you. It's their responsibility to pay the super. So if you don't include your super details, and if you don't include the amount of super that you're due on your invoice, the person paying you should still review your invoice and say, oh, this is the contractor that I need to pay super to, and then reach out to you and get those details. So basically, you as a person, invoicing people for your time and whatnot, there's no, you can reissue your invoice saying, okay, super is due to me. But it's the responsibility of the person who's paying you to assess whether or not super is payable, and it's their responsibility to pay you that super if it is payable.
Great, thank you. I've also got another question from Karen. Is super due in the quarter that the invoice is dated, or the date the invoice is paid?
I believe it's paid, but I'll get back to you.
Great, cool.
And I'll get back to you, Karen. That's all good. I know,
Karen. So I'm just having a quick look. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in, and I'm very wary of time. I might just jump into a question from Michael. If I, a sole trader and working at a venue and contracting musicians to perform with me, is super paid to me as a percentage of the total fee, or as a percentage of my proportion of the fee? I think, again, that's the whole thing around, you have to negotiate that up front.
Yes. So I'm just rereading your question again. So you're working and you're contracting performers, okay? So you sort of have that instance that we were talking about before, where the venue's hired you and then you're hiring other people. So again, review the contract. If, the venue, you as a sole trader, is paying you, super likely payable, and then you have hired support musicians to help you, you would need to pay the support musicians from there. And whether or not you sort of negotiate that with the venue in the first instance, saying, well, I'm going to hire some support musicians, I would need an additional 10.5% for my fee so that I can pass that on to them, in actual cash, then you'd need to talk to, when you're in the negotiating sort of stages, so it's all part of the fee.
Right, we've got some questions such as, any super you believe has the best return, and things like that.
I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not allowed to say. And I actually genuinely don't know. As this person who, I love sitting here and like waxing lyrical about super and whatnot. I've been with the same super fund since I, started working at Domino's Pizza. So, I'm not an expert, but in any sort of case, super funds, one super fund will perform great one year, another super fund will perform great the next year. They're always moving all of the time. You would need to consult a financial planner, or I'm sure you could even just Google as well, being like, on average, what's the best, the funds that performs the best, that has the lowest fees. That's also something to look into as well. I'm pretty sure the ATO has a comparison guide, or some like Australian government agency has a comparative guide that shows you what the fees are and what average returns sort of are. But nothing for you, unfortunately.
So I have a question that's around if an independent artist, a sole trader, is employed by a festival, they should be getting paid super. I mean, it's just another scenario, and I can see a few kind of questions because there are so many different kind of ways that people work within the industry. But again, if they're being paid to perform or for
to support the performing,
then they should be getting paid super.
Yeah, but always, if in doubt, refer to the ATO decision tool, basically, and then just take that to the person who's contracted you and say, okay, this is what the ATO have said, I'm owed super, can you please pay me super, essentially.
Cool. And I'm just seeing there's a couple of like repeat things. People are like, how do I go about recouping super? Those sorts of questions. So I feel like there's the sorts of things that we can follow up with afterwards. Yeah, and I think there's quite a few specific things that we can probably get back to people at a later date. I think you've gone through most of the things in here, unless there's anything you can see in the questions that are sticking out to you.
Nothing that is coming through in my quick glance. But yeah, so I mean, the long or the short of it is that, you know, you probably need to be paid super. You know, if you're a sole trader and you're performing or you're supporting somebody to perform, then you probably need super paid to you. Go back to the people that you're contracting with and say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but, you know, because I'm a musician and I'm a sole trader, you need to pay me super. And just, you know, it's about sort of, if everybody discusses it all of the time, everybody will normalize it, and this won't be a thing of like, oh, I've got to go and talk to somebody about, you know, getting paid for an additional super and whatnot. The knowledge about this in the music sort of community is quite low. So, you know, the more the people are aware about it, the more it will empower them to get paid, because you're still getting paid. You know, these are fees that you're still getting paid to you. It's just going to your super fund rather than to your actual bank account. And that, you know, that 10.5% super will sit in your super fund for, you know, 40, 50 years or something like that. And that, you know, $100 will turn into a couple of thousands of dollars by the time you retire. So it's important to get paid the super that you're owed, essentially.
So use the super calculator that we'll send out to everyone. We've popped it in the chat as well, but just so that you can kind of work on case by case scenario as you go. And, you know, use the other tools like the ABN lookup to understand if that impacts you. We'll also have this resource. We'll also have a great kind of list of questions that Generate have prepared specifically for us that are a little bit more tailored for the music industry. You can look through that. You know, be aware of like all of this stuff. Make sure that you include your super details in your invoices and negotiate up front with people, you know, what it is that you're like what you're going to get paid, if it's inclusive or exclusive. And yeah, you can always check back in on all of this amazing information. Thank you so much, Emma. And thanks to Generate for like taking the time to, you know, just put all of this stuff together. It is a very complex sort of things to kind of get your head around, I think. So yeah, it's been really great to hear from you. Thank you so much.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Right. And thanks everyone for joining